Hello, students, and welcome to my first screencast for the 2018 school year here at TASM. This is for my biology class, the 9th grade class. This is to help you prepare for the first test on experimental design, the characteristics of life in ecology. Just like it says up here, I'm going to get a lot of my images from Khan Academy. Those are all freely available there. And this little logo down here means that I will not profit from this video, and neither should anybody else. The whole purpose of it is to help you, the students in our class. So what should you be doing to prepare for this test? You should check out the study guide. You should look at all the bullet points and make sure that you can explain them. You should go back through Google Classroom. Check out the POGLs that we did in class. Look at the synthesis questions in them. Look at the key points and make sure that you can describe them. You should be able to talk about these topics with a friend, with a family member, be able to describe them in the context of a story. That's a lot better than just trying to memorize definitions. And so really, I hope that you've been able to use our lessons to figure out the phenomena we've been going over in class and to really explain them. And just remember, Eugene, TASM, and Azeva Beach are right here. We're all wishing you good luck, and it's all about the journey, not just the test score, but the journey to understand the material. Let's dive in. Okay, the first part was on reviewing experimental design. You all did really well in this in class. We did the little hydrogen peroxide experiment. We made elephant's toothpaste, and we talked about music experiments and heart rate. And you really showed me that you remembered from middle school independent and dependent variables, the importance of control variables, and a control group. So let's apply it to the first video that we watched in class about Robert Payne's starfish experiment. So he took these starfish out of tidal pools on the Pacific Northwest coast and watched what happened to the pools. So remember, in some pools he did it, in others he didn't. And he was looking at species diversity left over afterwards. So take a moment and pause the video and ask yourself, what was the independent variable, dependent variable, constants, and control group? Okay, did you get that the independent variable is removing a starfish? So in some tidal pools, he removed a starfish, and in others, he didn't. The dependent variable would be the species diversity left over. So here's before the starfish were taken out. You have lots of different species. 1 year after removal, the number of species has gone down. This is interesting, right? The starfish are the apex predator in the tidal pool. And look at this, really interesting. You saw those stark pictures in class. 5 years after removing a starfish, the only thing that's left was just a monoculture of mussels. So that would be the dependent variable, the species diversity. The independent variable is removing the starfish. And then what did he keep controlled, right? He would need to have, or what constants did he have? He would need to do this at the same time of day and just make sure that everything's the same in between each pool except for the starfish. If different pools had different apex predators, then you would expect different results. And a control group would be comparing it. A control means a standard for comparison. So he'd be comparing it to another pool that did not have the starfish removed. So hopefully that makes sense in the light of experimental design, and that you remember our lesson on keystone species and trophic cascades with Robert Payne and the green world hypothesis. Here's a nice little graph just showing right? If we were to do claim, evidence, reasoning, this would be the evidence showing that the starfish were the keystone species. And then your reasoning would be you could talk about what a keystone species is and what happens, just like an arch. When you remove the keystone from the top, the arch crumbles down. So without the keystone starfish, it crumbled down. The ecosystem did. And here it is. Sorry, I forgot I had that picture in it. All right, and so without that keystone arch, it came crumbling down. Okay, you test yourself, right? And we'll get to do this later on in the year. How would you set up an experiment on bean germination? What would be your independent variables, dependent variables, control variables, and control group? This could be something fun, easy to try from Lulu. You can do it for less than a row. All right, the next part we did was the characteristics of life. We looked at pond water underneath our great microscopes here at TASM, and you tried to identify some paramecium in the pond water. You might have seen some rotifers, some other cool stuff. So why are you alive, students? And Eugene, our stuffed gorilla, is not. Okay, hopefully it's because you remember the 7 characteristics of life. Sometimes there's 8, like responding to evolution. Either one's fine. The whole point is just that there are characteristics that make us alive. You don't need to memorize these. You just need to be able to put them into context. So what I'll ask you now is to pause the video and see if you can tell a little story about each of these characteristics of life. All right, metabolism. Here we go. The crafty express, crafty kitchen, right? We all need to take food, we oxidize it, we break it down into energy. And so it's all about getting energy, and then there's a cycle of life with photosynthesis and plants, which are taking sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to make foods that the rest of us can eat. We respond to stimuli, right? So plants, us, bacteria, everything responds to something, whether it's light, temperature, odor, sound, gravity, heat, water, pressure, cell signals. My AP students are studying what do guppies respond to, and they're trying to do some experiments with statistical techniques on it. So even the bacterium responds to cell signals, right? Don't sell them short. So their cell signals can tell them to light up or do all kinds of cool stuff. Growth and development. Here you go. You've probably been to Muya before, but my baby girl is growing, right? And we all undergo growth and development, even the tiniest bacterium. So when a bacteria divides through binary fission, it's going to split into 2 smaller ones, and it's still going to need to grow and develop as well. Reproduction. Without being able to pass on our genes, species wouldn't continue. There wouldn't be life on Earth. Right? So species either reproduce asexually without sex, just by budding or binary fission, or they reproduce sexually through a combination of male and female gametes. Heredity. So everything that's alive on Earth has DNA. It has a genetic code. We'll learn all about this later on, but here are chromosomes. So this is called a karyotype. And you can tell it's a boy because it's X, Y. And a section of a chromosome is called a gene. And that gene can code for certain traits. And what is a gene made up of? It's made up of DNA. And we'll study that a lot, and we'll get really into it, and we'll do some examples with lactose intolerance. Okay, we're all made of cells. And so we've looked at some cells underneath the microscope, and we'll look at many more as we get into our cell unit. And so this gives us the cell theory. There's a pretty cool TED Ed movie on that as well you can check out. Homeostasis, there'll definitely be a question about this on your test, right? So we're trying to keep things the same. That's what homeostasis means. Here's an example of body temperature. So if you get hot, you're going to sweat. If you get cold, you're going to shiver. And then we did a nice example in class of your glucose levels. What happens when your glucose levels rise because you ate that pasta salad for lunch? And then what happens when they get low? What does your body do with insulin and the pancreas? I'm not going to lecture you on that. I'd like for you to look it up and try and remember it. It's a fascinating topic to study. All right, we're through 2 sections already. So here we go on ecology. We're going to go through, I went in the order of the study guide, and hopefully this will help you out. So can you give a basic overview of the water cycle, carbon cycle, and nitrogen cycle? I am definitely not going to ask you to memorize it or to show me all the different parts. What's more important, in my opinion, is to see how humans affect these cycles and how aberrations or effects on these cycles affect our Earth. All right, here's the water cycle. So in our class, we use the water models to show transpiration. Remember that water is a polar molecule. It has those positive Mickey Mouse ears and the negative chin, right? The oxygen's a more electronegative element, so it's going to be negative, and the hydrogens will be more positive. So the opposites will attract. A hydrogen will be attracted to an oxygen. It's called a hydrogen bond. And when a water molecule escapes from a stomata or a hole in a leaf on a tree to go to an area where there's less water, the outside, it'll pull the next one up. So we went over that in class, transpiration. I think the rest of them you know or you've seen before. I'm not worried about sublimation. And then it's pretty cool in my environmental science class, we're studying infiltration and percolation of soils. But for your class, just basically knowing that there is groundwater, there are aquifers. And as humans, right, what are we doing to affect this system? Well, we're dramatically decreasing the amount of fresh water available, right? We're draining aquifers for irrigation. There's a famous aquifer in the United States, the Ogawa aquifer, that we're draining. We can contaminate water supplies. There's a lot more salt water and unusable water than there is fresh water for us. So if we alter it too much, we're going to have to wait for the water cycle to run its course. And will we have time for that, right? Or could it cause conflict? Okay, the carbon cycle. Big part here is more the biological component, that plants take in CO2 and they're going to make sugars. You use those sugars, you eat them, and then when you run around, you exhale carbon dioxide, so you're giving it back to the environment. There's also a geological aspect as well, dealing with volcanoes emitting carbon dioxide and getting into oceans, becoming rocks and sediment, and really forming that kind of a cycle. What's important here, how are we affecting it as humans? You've probably heard of carbon dioxide being emitted from cars and from plants. And look at this graph. This is from Khan Academy. You can just see the difference between historical fluctuations in the carbon dioxide levels and then what's up here. We can get this from measuring ice cores in the Arctic, etc. And then this is a very famous graph called the Keeling Curve. And we'll look at this later on. But this is showing it's a constant measurement of carbon dioxide readings in Hawaii, named after a guy who runs it. And we can see, like, look, we're way up there. Just in 2018, we're above 400 parts per million. And there's going to be, and we're already seeing repercussions from that. Last but not least, the nitrogen cycle. This can be a little complicated for intro bio, not worried about any of these ions or ammonification, etc. That's more of an AP thing, but what you can check out is what are the implications of it, right? So what happens if we add extra nitrogen into the system that would normally be there due to these processes? So for instance, if we took fertilizer, which is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, and dumped it on our lawn, we had a nice green lawn, but then we have a monsoon, a rainstorm, and it washes off into the ocean. What can happen? So hopefully you got that. We talked about this a little bit in class. Nitrogen is often a limiting nutrient. That means that the amount of nitrogen limits the plant growth in the area. Everything else that you need to grow plants is there, or that you need to grow algae is there, but you don't have enough nitrogen. So when you have a sudden influx, it could be natural or human caused. Here would be human caused of nitrogen into the system. You can get an algae bloom, and you can get these red tides that happen and these algae blooms that happen. So these, I mean, A, they just don't look nice. Would you want to go swimming in there? Do you want to go boating in there? And B, what's happening underneath the water? And so we talked just a little bit in class that this is covering the surface of the water and sunlight can't get in. These might be doing photosynthesis, but they can't get in here for the underwater plants to do photosynthesis. So it's creating low oxygen concentrations, right? And then as these algae start to die, they're eaten by bacteria, decomposers. Those bacteria are aerobic. They use oxygen, and they're going to use up the oxygen in the water. It's going to create what's called a hypoxic or an anoxic condition when there's not enough oxygen in the water. And you get the big fish kills where it's nasty. All these fish float up to the surface and they're dead, and it's really sad, right? And so we have a big dead zone here in the Oman Sea, and it's something that Sultan Qaboos University and a couple other universities are jointly studying. It's hopefully something that we can figure out. All right, so we're rolling along. This you all aced. We did that fun activity. We did the Yellowstone food chain, and you all put it together. So I'll ask you these questions. Can you make one? Can you make a food web? How much energy is transferred on average each level? Why is this? And then here's an interesting one. I snuck it into your study guide. I'm not sure if you've seen it yet. What are the implications of your findings? All right, so take a moment to pause the video and see how you do. Okay, here's a nice little food chain. We got producers, mollusks, small fish, and then a bigger fish. The Chinook salmon are pretty cool, right? They go up the rivers in the Pacific Northwest, and then they fight the rapids and jump over them. The bears eat them, and then they finally make it to the top and they reproduce, and then that's where it ends for them. They are so exhausted from their energy reservoirs that they then die. So it's a cool example of what's called similarity, and it's just really fascinating. But let's get back to it. These would be producers, consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. These, if they only ate plants, would be called herbivores. These, if they only ate primary consumers or other living organisms that aren't plants, they would be carnivores, etc. You all knew that. This would be the first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level, fourth trophic level. And what this pyramid's showing is that only 10% of the energy is transferred as you go from each level. Right? Where does that energy go? Well, it's lost as heat, it's lost as feces, and it's just some of it isn't eaten. Right? If you make bones, you're probably not going to eat a chicken bone. Right? You would eat the chicken meat, so it can get lost as well. This brings up a really key point in biology, that in a food web or in a food chain, energy flows through the system. There's a constant input of sunlight bringing in energy to the system that plants use. It then passes along each level. I challenge you, it's hard to find a food chain that's bigger than 5 or 6 steps. And it's because it's just limited by only being able to pass 10% on to each level. And so this energy flows through, whereas, excuse me, when you get on camera, your nose itches sometimes. When you have the nutrients in a system, the carbon, the oxygen, the water, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, they cycle through. So the carbon that's inside of you right now might have been in your grandfather's dog. It could have been inside of a desk from the 1800s. Okay, it could have been inside of a dinosaur. That carbon is constantly recycled, whereas energy flows through the system. So here's that last question. What is this? What is an implication for humans? Well, should you be a vegetarian? If only 10% of the energy available in the grain or livestock is then encompassed by a cow, and then you only get 10% of the energy from the cow, is that really efficient? If we have a growing population and we're running into issues, can we feed everybody? And so I think the answer would be yes. I mean, I don't think, I know the answer should be yes. The world will be a lot better off if we're all vegetarians, and you can definitely get enough protein, and it's a lot healthier for you as well. Okay, we're rolling along. Can you describe a brown food web and a green food web? I showed you a pretty fun TED Ed video on how close are you to having eaten poop in the last day. And so it was funny and you laughed about it in class. You could show it to your family as well. So here's, I screenshotted it right from the TED Ed because it's so good. It just shows us, that, right, 90% of plants aren't eaten. They're just eventually going to die and they're going to decompose on the ground, and they'll be what's called detritus, which are dead and decaying organisms. Well, we know as organisms decay, they're decaying because of bacteria. They're decaying because of worms. They're decaying because of fungi. And so, right, and you can always say, I'm a fun guy. Get it? Anyway. So the fungi are eating that decaying matter, and then they can be eaten by mice and other organisms. We eat mushrooms. I love mushrooms on pizza. It's delicious. So you're just a couple steps away from a brown food web that has as its base detritus. The 10% rule still applies. There's still a limit to the number of trophic levels, and energy is lost as heat. But this is just an example of how the nutrients cycle in a system: the carbon, the water, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus. Okay. Oh. Okay, I'm going to try and pause the video. Okay, pardon that interruption. So they might ring the alarm system. I'm here at school. It's a lot easier for me to do this at school because I got little kids. So if that starts ringing off, I'll pause the video. I might have to end it and then finish it later. Okay, can you describe a trophic cascade? We did this fun activity in class. This is straight from the movie with the otters and the sea urchins and the kelp forest. So go ahead and look through it. Can you describe the relationships? Here I want you to put a plus or minus. Did the otters help the urchins, or did the otters decrease the urchin because they eat them? And then over here, we drew those dashed lines, and I want you to say, what's the indirect effect between otters and the kelp? And also try it over here for these bass and all the way down to the algae. Okay, let's see how you did. So otters decrease the number of urchins because they eat them. They're so cute. They hold hands and float on their back. The urchin decreased the kelp because they eat the kelp. So what do the otters do to the kelp forest? Because they decrease the number of urchins, the otters end up helping the kelp forest. So having otters around helps to keep a kelp forest, which helps to promote biodiversity. Lots of things love to live in kelp forests. Oh, I guess I kind of gave it away over here on the right. Sorry about that. But fish and crabs, etc. My dad taught me that you always want to fish around structure. Okay, so here's some bass. So the bass are going to eat the smaller fish. The smaller fish are going to eat the Daphnia. The Daphnia are going to eat the algae. And so what is the effect here? This is a 4-step chain. This is a little tougher. Were you able to figure it out? This number is going to go down. So that means these are going to go up because they have less predators. So these will go down. So it's an overall negative impact between the bass and the algae. So this is a trophic cascade. There are many factors at play. Oftentimes they're this simple and sometimes they're not this simple. Okay, and so over a while they might balance out because then if these don't have enough, if the Daphnia don't have enough food, they might crash out. And that's when we got into talking about logistic growth. All right. Oh, there it is. Can you compare and contrast exponential growth and logistic growth? And then a tricky question, can an elephant show exponential growth? So you should take out a pen and paper. Can you draw those graphs and kind of describe what's going on? Here they are. So an exponential growth is kind of like a J-shaped growth, and logistics more like an S. So what are they showing? They're showing that over time, the population isn't increasing at a linear rate. It's increasing at an exponential rate. So it's going from 1 bacteria to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 to 128. And the same thing can happen with elephants. It's just going to take a longer time. Since they can be pregnant for up to 2 years, it's just going to take longer. But as Darwin noted on The Origin of Species, they could increase exponentially and would take over the entire Earth. Every living organism can increase exponentially, but we're all restricted by an upward limit called carrying capacity. And a carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that an environment can sustain. What are the factors that contribute to carrying capacity? Hopefully you answered that while you're thinking about drawing the graphs. It would be things like food, space, sunlight for plants. We have to have the resources necessary to live. Now, one thing I showed my AP students is it's not always this simple of a graph, right? Populations can overshoot their carrying capacity and then come crashing back down. And that gets into different lifestyle not choices, but different lifestyle selections or styles. And so that gets into R and K species. So I'm sorry, this was supposed to be animated. So maybe you could back the video up and describe R and K species. What are the differences between them? So here, if you've done it now, you can see K, I just remember K for carrying capacity. If you take AP Bio, it's in the logistic growth rate formula. And you're going to see that this is what humans are, right? We live for a long time. It takes a while for us to get to reproductive maturity. We have just a few children, but then think about what your parents have done for you. They've invested a lot of time and care into bringing you up to be the best people that you can be. And you're wonderful because of it. And so here, that's what a K-selected species is. And then R-selected species would be like bacteria, the sea snails, ants, things that can reproduce rapidly, usually don't provide much parental care, and they're just trying to make it by having as many as fast as possible. A lot of times students tend to think that K-selected species are better or more advanced, but remember the ultimate goal is to pass on your genes. Bacteria are R-selected species, and they've been here before humans, and they'll be here after humans. So think about that. Food for thought. All right. So along with that, This is just kind of a vocab question, but describing density dependent and density independent factors. But it's important to think about as you're talking about if a population's at its carrying capacity. So go ahead. Okay, did you get for density dependent? Predation, disease, competition, food, water, space. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry. I had to scratch above my nose. So the density dependent, it depends upon the population density, right? Just like you are dependent upon your parents. So these are factors that are dependent upon the number of organisms around. Density independent would be things like natural disasters like Hurricane Florence or these California wildfires or habitat destruction, right? Or if we built a mall where a bunch of camels used to live, we would displace them. That would be a density independent factor. So both of these combine, well, and these can be, they can come and just rapidly reduce population numbers, but they help to determine a carrying capacity. All right, we're rolling through. So what's a niche, also pronounced a niche? And can you describe the competitive exclusion principle? All right, how'd you do? Did you get, that a niche is a way of life? It's defined by the full sets of conditions, resources, and interactions it needs, right? That's from Khan Academy. So I told you to think about it as like your job and where you live, right? Your niche is to be a student at TASM. And that's where you are and that's where you thrive, right? So the niche of a camel would be in the desert and it's searching for food. The niche of, say, some of the fish here around Masira Island in Oman would be, that's where they live and, how are they camouflaged in and what do they eat? So what is the competitive exclusion principle? If you remember, we did this virtual lab in class where you grew paramecium in different test tubes, and paramecium aurelia and caudatum, if they both are grown alone, they exhibit exponential growth, and then they hit a carrying capacity and exhibit logistic growth, right? So this would be the exponential phase, and in here it's at carrying capacity. So they're going to grow fine alone. Now, if you grow them together, you might have noticed they start out okay and they start growing together, but then they reach a point around days 3 or 4 where the caudatums start to die and the aurelia start to outcompete them. And so this is what it means by competitive exclusion. The caudatum get excluded competitively, they lose to the aurelia. And what's happening here is they're both trying to occupy the exact same niche. So if you ever try and occupy the exact same niche, you're going to have competition and you could have extinction. And I showed you a video of the Asian carp doing that as they escaped from the Mississippi catfish farms and have gone and wreaked havoc all over the U.S. So that begs the question of, I forgot one thing. So along with the niche, right, what's your range of tolerance for learning in class? Like what temperature do you like it? And what about the lighting? Take a second to answer that. Okay, so I would bet it's probably around like 19 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees Celsius. All this is saying is that there's abiotic factors that affect where your niche can be. We can't learn very effectively outside in 40 degree Celsius temperatures, at least not all day, right? We might be able to do a quick trip. And so you might see zones of stress and zones of intolerance. So think back to the algae blooms that we talked about earlier. When the dissolved oxygen content levels went down too much, those fish went into stress, and then all of a sudden the niche changed and they couldn't live in it and they died. All right, so we went over competitive exclusion. They're fighting over a niche right there. But how about niche partitioning? It might look like two organisms are occupying the same niche, but they might really be partitioning it. So what does that mean? And can you give some examples? Well, here we go. They might be eating at slightly different places, right? This flamingo might be able to eat here, but the ducks are there, etc. It's not the best example, sorry. Or here, this one was really fascinating in class. We watched that HHMI clip, and you saw that in the Serengeti, the zebras come through first, and they're going to eat after the rains when the grass is high. They're going to mow it down a little bit for the wildebeest, who will come next, and then the gazelles come last when it's just the shoots. And it's pretty cool, right? They're all eating the same grass, but they're eating it at different times So they're partitioning the niche, or they're dividing up the niche in a way that lets them coexist and co-live. If they didn't divide it up, or if they did not partition the niche, they would engage in competition via the competitive exclusion principle, and one of them would die out. Okay, so we just did this in class today. Can you compare and contrast a fundamental niche versus a realized niche? And I talked a little bit about, you're a high school student here in Muscat, Oman, and you could go to BSM, ABA, etc., but you're not in their computer systems, etc. So really, your realized niche, or where you can really go to high school and what you can really do, is right here. Your fundamental niche is you could go to any of these, but you're restricted by the system. So here, once they realize there's competition, the semibolanus barnacles take over this area. The hypothalamus can't beat them, so the hypothalamus is up here. But hypothalamus could live in the whole area. So your fundamental niche is the whole area you could take over. You could live in any room in your house, but you have to stay at night in your room, right? Otherwise, you'd be bugging other people. So that'd be your realized bedroom or your realized niche. I encourage you to look at some other examples of this, especially with the anole lizards. Okay, we're rolling along. Contrast primary and secondary succession. All right, so here is a nice picture of plants in Hawaii growing on lava, right? So that would be primary succession when you got new land is forming on bare rock, and there's going to be colonization by plants that can sustain it, and then they'll die and start to create soil, and you'll start to see a progression take forth as you bring forth new ecosystems. All right. And in here, if you have a wildfire event, you can see secondary succession. So the soil is already there, and what would grow back. So what's important about that? Well, if we have these types of disasters, we can look and see what's coming back afterwards. We can predict recovery rates, and we can try and help it, maybe so. All right, can you give an example of each of the following? Go ahead and pause the video. All right, here comes some of my examples. So we went over ticks eating your blood. That'd be a parasite. Learning from each other. I'm learning from you. You're learning from me. You learn from each other in the class. That it's an example of mutualism. Your friends should all be a mutualistic relationship. Commensalistic, one benefits while the other doesn't, kind of like a barnacle and a whale. Helps the barnacle, the whale doesn't care. And predation, the wolves are hunting the elk. All right. We went over Rachel Carson and DDT and Silent Spring. You should tell your parents and family about that. So why should pregnant women not consume sushi? Can you explain biomagnification? All right. Did you get something like this, right? We did the dots in class. We cut out dots and we put them on the producers, and then we put them on the zooplankton, and we put them in the small fish, the large fish, and then finally into the apex predators. So here it's got birds, but these poisons, things like microplastics, mercury, etc., reside in fat tissues in the animals, and they can't be metabolized. They can't. They stay inside the system. So as the fish eat more and more and more of the small fish, they're going to get a higher concentration, and that can lead to real problems. And so it's really sad. And there's a famous example of that off of Japan with some mercury poison. All right, last but not least, this is it. Good. Biodiversity. I appreciate you sticking with it if you made it to here. We watched a nice little TED Ed clip on this, and then we did the questions together. Can you describe ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity? And then I really like the example of biodiversity as a net, right? And we had this net supporting our Earth, and what's happening if we keep cutting parts out. Okay, pause the video and see if you can get them. Did you get ecosystem is just different ecosystems within a region or the Earth? Things like desert ecosystem, Arctic ecosystem, the Amazon one in the video. Species are the number of species in a given ecosystem. It's pretty cool how we measure that. We can do things called diversity indices, where we look at how many species there are and then how many of each animal there are. And then genetic diversity. We talked a little bit about having different genes, right? So if a disease comes, you want to have people with different genes, so hopefully somebody's resistant to it, and then they can pass those genes on. And so here's just a picture of it. All right, students, that takes it to the end of my review. Good luck studying for your test. You can come in for my review session. You can ask me questions anytime. Remember to utilize the resources on Google Classroom and to really tell examples and paint a story of what we learned. Take care and have a wonderful day.